What a year. Does the country finish the year in better shape than it started? That has to be the measure, doesn't it? Just like your household finances, just like your kids' education, like your garden for that matter. We want things that we care about to improve with our care and attention. We want our country to improve every year, economically, socially, environmentally, culturally, and we want it always to be secure and helping to deliver a secure world. By any measure, 2023 has been an abject failure, and that's pretty sad. It's not often we can say that our country was diminished over the year, that we've gone backwards. But I checked back on my opening program for the year back in mid-January, and apparently it was reasonably predictable. It's going to be a tough year ahead, I reckon. A little bit of chaos around the place this year, and we'll be all over it. Early on, the signs were surprisingly good for Anthony Albanese and his government. Remember, I always said the worries was that they'd be weak on border security and weak on China, and they started off saying and doing the right things. And the economy has held up pretty well, buoyed largely by the exports that Labor hates, the coal and gas that the rest of the world can't get enough of, and the iron ore too, the iron ore that they need more of our coal to turn into steel. But in the real economy, in small business and in family budget, it's been a terrible year. Living standards have gotten worse. And that's completely the opposite to what Labor promised.
Where in your economic plan is there any measure that would actually keep interest rates lower?
Because the priority that we've had in terms of our investments have been in areas which will grow productivity.
You can vote for more secure work, better pay, and meaningful help with your cost of living.
Cheaper electricity bills, $275 a year off your electricity bill.
Wrong, wrong, and wrong. Interest rates have gone up a dozen times. Inflation has seen cost of living pressures mount week by week, and power prices have only moved in one direction, ever upwards. 3 strikes and you're out, Albo. But it gets worse. Albanese eventually did kowtow to China. All starry-eyed after his visit to Beijing, the PM suppressed a Chinese Navy sonar attack on our sailors. He kept that quiet just to avoid confrontation with Xi Jinping. Weak and embarrassing for our nation. And the weakness has mounted. Labor had no plans and no idea of how to deal with 148 criminal non-citizens freed from detention. Most of them were probably let out prematurely, but certainly all were let out without the necessary controls in place. Half a dozen of them, as you know, have allegedly reoffended since their release. Around the same time, a people smuggling boat delivered asylum seekers to our mainland shores for the first time in a decade. Then, in the wake of the horrendous Hamas terrorist attack against Israel on October the 7th, we saw scenes in Australia that most of us thought we would never see. Just a warning, this stuff is vile and disturbing. Now, the response here from the New South Wales Police, from the New South Wales Labor government and the Albanese federal government was muted. And this weakness only encouraged more protests, even intimidation of Jewish communities by angry mobs. This is multicultural Australia breaking down. This is intolerable division in our society. Incredibly, sickeningly inspired by a terrorist atrocity in the Middle East. And what has the Albanese government done since then? Well, it's effectively given in to the baying mob, abandoning Australia's previously strong support for Israel at the United Nations, and just this week refusing a US request to join a naval operation in the Red Sea to protect shipping from attacks that are related to these Middle East tensions. So Australia is now spineless on the global stage, an unreliable ally, and falling into the pack, back into the pack of the UN sycophants and apologists. Just let this sink in. Australia has made decisions on the Middle East conflict that have been welcomed by Hamas, the bloodthirsty terrorist organisation, and have let down Israel, the liberal democracy. And we've made a decision about a naval deployment that has disappointed our great ally, the United States, and has been welcomed by our great strategic threat, China. We also continue to undermine our own economic future with energy policies that make our electricity unreliable and unaffordable. And on top of all that, there's the voice. Yes, the Indigenous voice. This was a carefully formulated plan to advance reconciliation and deliver constitutional recognition in a practical way. It was formulated as a non-partisan project, Indigenous leaders working with constitutional conservatives. I've been writing about this for nearly a decade. But Albanese grabbed it and ran with it, and he immediately imbued it with a sense of leftist triumphalism. He wanted it for Labor, and in doing so, he wrecked it. He didn't work hard enough to get bipartisan support through compromise. He never properly understood what it was all about, and he refused to provide proper detail to the public. And his approach virtually invited the coalition to oppose it. That they did, expertly and cynically in some cases. And so the nation divided on the issue that was supposed to unite us. They were expected to vote on the unknown and the unexplained, and the referendum was defeated. Reconciliation's been set back a generation, and neither side of politics has mentioned anything of substance about Indigenous affairs since. Once more, Indigenous issues are out of sight and out of mind. It's almost as if a voice might be needed, which is exactly what Labor and Liberals have proposed at various times, but it was killed by partisan politics. And whether you support a voice or oppose it, we can all agree what occurred was a disaster, and the person who wears most of the blame has to be Albanese. Another big misstep this year was the pathetic review announced into our nation's COVID response. It'll be a whitewash. Australians deserve a full National Royal Commission, but our politicians just want to forget the whole thing. So it's been a bad year for Australia. On top of all that, a crook umpiring decision kept the Crows out of the finals. In fact, it was only our sports people who gave us some hope and joy this year. The Matildas, the Diamonds, our cricketers, both the women and the men. But our politicians, well, they've let us down this year, along with much of the media, I guess. Climate alarmism rather than energy realism, virtue signalling teachers instead of solid educations, uncontrolled immigration and a housing crisis instead of orderly population policy. Surely the greatest challenges for this country are obvious. Restoring affordable and reliable energy as the foundation of our economy, repairing an education system that's sliding further backwards the more money we tip in, controlling runaway government spending, eradicating Indigenous disadvantage, entrenching social cohesion and tolerance, and ensuring we've got the policy settings, hardware and defence personnel to keep us safe. Have we made progress on any of those this year? No. In 2023, we went backwards. That's not good enough. And the real worry, the sting in the tail, is that indications are all that this will get worse in 2024.